So Beth, look, thanks for coming on to the Built for Creators podcast. If you could just give us a bit of an introduction of who you are and what you do as such.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm Beth Chapman. I'm founder and managing director of Starlinks Global. I've spent my career in cross-border logistics. I started a very, very long time ago at Royal Mail, then moved to a business called P2P as one of their owner directors, which we sold to FedEx in 2017. I did try and retire, but it didn't last very long because I got bored. And then in 2022, I started Starlinks Global. And Starlinks Global helps retailers deliver to over 200 countries, including harder to reach markets with seamless, reliable and fully tracked delivery solutions.
Okay, amazing. So, I mean, just as the background, guys, Starlinks are a partner of ours and we work with them quite a lot. Now, there's been a lot of disruption over the past couple of years. Things like Brexit, COVID strikes, tariffs, as of yesterday as well, and probably the last couple of months. I mean, from your perspective, how are these events reshaping global delivery?
Yeah, I mean, look, Brexit was a real turning point for many retailers, especially those who had built their businesses on seamless trade with the EU. Suddenly they were dealing with complex customs processes, unexpected tariffs and delays that they weren't prepared for. But Brexit was just one example. It set the tone for what has followed, a period of constant disruption in global logistics. And carriers today are absolutely facing more challenges than ever before. It's not just the frequency of disruption, it's their scale and speed. Whether it's a geopolitical event like the US tariff changes that I'm sure we'll come on to discuss in more detail, or environmental issues like the extreme flooding in Dubai last year that shut down airports. These challenges don't just impact one region, they ripple across global supply chains. And on top of that, consumer expectations have never been higher. Retailers can't afford long delays or unreliable deliveries. So carriers have had to evolve fast to keep up. So at Starlinks Global, we've built our business around navigating these disruptions. We don't just react when something goes wrong. We proactively monitor and adapt so that our retailers stay ahead of the curve. Because in today's world, resilience isn't optional, it's essential.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, can you dig into that like in a bit more detail then? So, like, how do you do things differently in Starlinks Global compared to like some of your competitors in that case?
So we've engineered into everything that we do, from the technology platforms we've built to track parcels to how we manage customer services. We've built resilience into our solutions to future-proof the business, making us a trusted long-term partner for our retailers. And speaking of resilience, at Starlinks Global, we build resilience at two levels. Globally, by ensuring we have redundancy across all markets, and locally by adapting to the unique challenges of each region. From a global perspective, resilience means always having options. If a clearance route is disrupted, we have alternatives. If an airline is regularly bumping freight, we switch to another. If a particular carrier is struggling, we adjust the last mile delivery partner. Retailers can't afford delays because one part of the supply chain fails. So we make sure we have multiple contingencies in place across nearly 200 countries. But local resilience is different. It's about understanding the nuances of each market, because what works in one country won't necessarily work in another. If you take the US, for example, the Postmaster General who recently resigned, that have pushed more volume into regional carriers. It's been great in some cases, but it's also caused major strain, as we saw with the recent collapse of Pandion. That's why we don't rely on just one fallback option. We have layered contingencies so retailers aren't left stranded if one carrier or clearance route fails. And the other critical part of resilience is getting the right information to retailers fast. Growing trend of half-baked logistics updates spreading online, causing unnecessary panic. So we spend a lot of time fact-checking, speaking directly to partners on the ground, and making sure our retailers get real insights, not speculation. And that's what makes us the trusted partner in the room, which I know you and I have discussed in the past.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, that's an area that I really want to touch on, because, I mean, I originally understood Starlinks around the cross-border aspect and the support that you provide e-commerce brands when doing that. but actually there's a really big value piece that you have there in terms of like the post-purchase experience and building that relationship with the customer and also the customer's customers. And that I didn't realize was such a value piece, but one of the things that is helping with the success that you're seeing. Can you give me a bit more of an insight in terms of how you're doing that and why you think it's so valuable for customers these days?
Yeah, look, I think in delivery, waiting for a problem to happen is already too late. That's why we track 100% of shipments against critical time checkpoints. We analyse patterns to predict delays before they impact retailers and then their customers. So if we detect potential disruptions, whether it's an airline frequently bumping freight, a final mile carrier struggling in certain areas, or even incorrect consignee details, then we act immediately. We don't wait for parcels to get stuck. We fix issues before they happen. And look, I think a great example of this is the unique way in which we manage lates and exceptions. So we have a system that detects shipments at risk of becoming undeliverable due to missing address details or incorrect contact information. So instead of waiting for a failed delivery, we intervene proactively, correcting data, ensuring compliance, and keeping parcels moving. And that's one of the reasons we've achieved an undeliverable rate of just 0.26%, which is far, far below the industry norms. And the result is fewer failed deliveries, lower WSMO contact rates, and reduced costs for our retailers, which ultimately has to mean happier customers.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I was talking to Grant, and he was telling me about the unique setup you have so that you can get those parcels across border quicker as well. Talk to me a bit more about that, because I mean that's such a value piece as well, isn't it? Like, at the end of the day, even if you're selling across the world, people still want that parcel as quickly as possible.
They do. Look, and I think part of the secret in this has to be in how we onboard our customers. And look, we actively promote ourselves as a delivery business, but underpinning that is the fact that we are a technology business as well. So data is critical in everything that we do, and starting at how we onboard any retailer of ours is so important. So understanding what their descriptions are like, the validity of their HS codes, what their address and consignee detail information, do they have phone numbers, do they have email addresses? Because without that information, how do we then follow up with the consignee on the lates and exceptions process? So for us, the devil is in the detail, and we start right at the very beginning in how we onboard our customers and taking them through those very, very specific data checks.
Where do you think your competitors are getting this wrong? Because, of course, this is a value piece for Starlinks, and it's definitely a value piece. But why do you think others aren't doing it? And why do you think it's so important for your customers?
Look, I think for us, we know that everyone is aware that our tagline is never just a parcel, and it has to be never just a parcel all the time, not never just a parcel some of the time. So we start from something which seems incredibly obvious, but let's start from the parcel actually getting delivered, because the last thing we want is the parcel coming back as an undeliverable, because then there's an unhappy consignee that's going to complain to a retailer and potentially never buy from that retailer again. If they don't buy from that retailer again, that retailer isn't going to give us any parcels. So our entire reason to be has to get parcels delivered, which is why we monitor that undeliverable rate so hard, and how we monitor the lates and exceptions to ensure those parcels are in fact getting delivered. And I think a lot of our industry has started from get as many parcels in as you can, which of course is marvellous. We all want volume, and then just ship it out. But not only do we have a moral responsibility to get those parcels delivered, we also have an environmental responsibility, because none of us should be moving parcels halfway around the world just for them to come back as an undeliverable. So our focus actually starts at the end as opposed to the beginning. How do we get the parcels delivered? And then we work back from the end to the very beginning to understand how we achieve that. And I think that's what we do differently to everybody else. And the stats don't lie.
No, I get it. I think it's fascinating as well, the emphasis you guys place on the post-purchase communication side of things and how you build that into your technology stack. I mean, we have that within our own technology stack as well, and we're finding more and more customers are adopting it. I think I was listening to a podcast the other week, and it was talking about Uber's model on how they the reason Uber was so successful was you could track the taxi throughout the process of it arriving to you. And it removed that worry and that doubt that everybody has when they phone up a taxi and it's 2 minutes late. And therefore they're worried, oh, have I ordered it or have I booked it? And it creates a negative feeling, a brand straight off the bat. And that's a taxi. Now, for a e-commerce brand, that's heightened so much because you're sat there, you're excited for your parcel, you're waiting for it to arrive. And if you're expecting it to arrive on Tuesday and it arrives on Wednesday, now as a customer, I probably am not that bothered, but I just want to know because I'm expecting it on and I think, yeah, it's fascinating how brands are taking into that consideration and they're understanding that more and they're moving towards that. And I know that there are couriers that do provide that tracking level, but I think it's becoming more granular now and it's going, okay, brands need to own communication. So rather than it being coming from the courier specifically, brands should be using it to build in better branding, positioning, upsell opportunity. How can they build a further brand experience rather than passing it over to a courier? Like at the end of the day, you've spent money to acquire that customer in some format. Why are you providing a really important moment in that e-commerce journey? Why are you letting somebody else manage that communication? It doesn't make sense, which is why I like your post-purchase side of things, where people can customize that communication with the customer, and similarly why it works so well for us.
Yeah, I think there's so many different things there because there are many retailers that actually don't want the carriers to tackle that for them, and they're working with the post-purchase platform providers like a Navar. But I think when one is communicating directly with the consignee, which of course as carriers we must do, then we need to make that brand experience and the tone of voice as familiar as possible to the consignee, which is why we work with our retailers on ensuring that they're very aware of the notifications that will go out. We can bespoke the wording to anything on any communication that we send out by retailers so that it's very much akin to their brand tone of voice and something that the consignee would be very familiar with. Exactly the same with our tracking sites. So the consignee might not know who we are, but they certainly know who the retailer is. So actually, if they're being directed to a tracking page, if it's branded as per the retailer, and actually they can go back from the tracking site back to the retailer site and potentially then purchase again, that's one of the things that we're super focused on now, because we understand that their familiarity is with the brand they've purchased from. We're also very hot now on tailoring the communications to different points of the journey. So actually, if it looks like a parcel might go dark for a couple of days, we have additional communications that we can send out. Or if a delivery has been attempted for a consignee and actually it's at a local post office or it's at a local collection point, we make sure that we're telling the consignee, this is where your parcel is, would you like to go and get it? As opposed to assuming they got the original communication, which actually they may not have received. So we do lots of that type of follow-up to ensure that they are getting the messaging to ensure the parcel gets delivered.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? Whether they're using, we do that within our technology. I also know that you do that as a service provider. And I think it's, for brands, it's almost understanding that technology there is readily accessible and it's usable now. Sometimes it feels like it's possible with some of the enterprise brands, but actually it's readily accessible technology now, no matter what size you are. And actually that customers are beginning to expect no matter what size you are. So therefore, to be competitive in your market, you need to be doing these things.
You should, because it's a basic service offering, isn't it? We have to be able to communicate with the consignee, and the retailers want to know what's happening as well from their side. So there has to be a flow of information back to them and a flow of information to the consignee, which has to be a standard part of the service offering.
Yeah, completely. Okay, lovely. So, you touched on the US, and actually, the US is a really thing I'm excited to talk to you today about, because hopefully you can have my understanding of everything that's happening over there. There's a lot of noise, and there has been a lot of noise now happening for a couple of weeks, actually a couple of months, really. I think Trump's gone into January and gone full steam. But if you could give me a bit of a breakdown, if we're going to go down the basis that the people that are listening to this podcast have an understanding that something's happening, but potentially they don't actually know what it is. Can you give me an idea of what's happened over the last 3 months to the point of the announcements yesterday? And I guess what brands need to be considering if they're deciding that they're going to start shipping into the US? Because at the end of the day, the US is a hugely popular market that lots of brands are wanting to expand into, but things have potentially got a little bit more complicated in how you're going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, for years, and we'll come on to what happened last night shortly, but look, for years, retailers shipping to the US have benefited from the de minimis rule, which allows parcels valued under $800 to enter duty free. But earlier this year, and February was an enormous amount of fun. But earlier this year, as part of Trump's ongoing China trade war, US Customs suddenly removed de minimis eligibility for goods originating from China and Hong Kong.
Sorry, Beth, can I just stop you there? For my purposes, can you just explain a little bit more about what the de minimis is for those that don't actually understand it? Because I appreciate it's quite a big thing.
Yeah, so de minimis is essentially a threshold below which no duty will be charged. So there are various different de minimis thresholds around the world, but specific to the US, the de minimis threshold is $800. So essentially, you can send anything into the US up to that $800 threshold, and it will enter duty free. But what happened in February, that de minimis with no notice got removed on China and Hong Kong origin goods. So overnight, shipments that have been clearing without issue were either rejected or hit with unexpected and then additional tariff surcharges. So that led to obviously multiple problems. Most retailers hadn't accounted for those costs at checkout, meaning they either had to absorb them or risk customers refusing to pay and rejecting their orders. And initially, a lot of people assumed that it was only going to impact the big marketplace players like Temu and Shein, who ship directly from China. But it wasn't just them. So it affected UK-based retailers too. So even if goods were held stock in UK or EU warehouses, if the goods were originally manufactured in China, they were still caught up in the change. Many brands were blindsided, thinking they were safe. Only to find that their shipments were delayed, returned, or suddenly more expensive to clear. And the result was chaos. So shipments got stuck at customs, costs skyrocketed, misinformation flooded the industry. And some retailers were even being advised to declare goods at cost price instead of retail to lower duties, which isn't a grey area, it's duty evasion, and could land them in serious legal trouble. So beyond the immediate disruption, there was also a huge compliance risk that many businesses weren't prepared for. So for retailers selling into the US, it wasn't just a short-term problem, it was a wake-up call. It proved just how quickly regulations can shift and how important it is to have a logistics partner who can react fast, provide clarity and keep shipments moving compliantly, which is what we did that week in February. I think we were one of the only countries who were able to ship every single day of that week because we had contingencies in place, because we understand the data. And then obviously at the end of that week, the tariffs got reinstated. The de minimis got reinstated, I should say, because of the chaos that had been created. But it was only a short-term reinstatement, which then leads us to what happened last night with Trump's announcement in the Rose Garden and then the executive orders that have subsequently followed.
Lovely. So, it sounds like a crazy few days on that side of things. But so going to yesterday then, and the conversations there, I guess the announcement from Trump. So what has Trump told? What are the changes on the tariffs and what are the changes on the de minimis?
Yeah, so there's two very specific executive orders that have been released after last night. And if we deal with the first one that deals with the de minimis removal, so the executive order focuses around, again, removing de minimis on China and Hong Kong goods. And there are two specific parts to this. One is goods that will enter the US via commercial clearance. And therefore, that's focused around country of origin. So anything that has a country of origin of China and Hong Kong, regardless of where it's shipped from, so shipped from the UK, for example, will have the de minimis withdrawn, so will attract duty. There is then obviously goods that enter the US via postal clearance. And at this stage, and I say at this stage because we're still waiting for the federal notice to be published that will have the implementation detail, But at this stage, it is believed that goods that will be entering via postal clearance, it will be on country of export. So goods that will be departing directly from China and Hong Kong, as opposed to goods that may be entering the US via a third country. So there's an important nuance of detail, but we're waiting for the exact wording of the federal notice to understand if that is indeed the case, that it is on country of export for postal as opposed to country of origin like commercial. And then if it is on country of export, there is something highly interesting in the executive order in that the responsibility will be moved to the carriers. Now, that doesn't mean us as a carrier or the final mile carrier. It means the airline carriers. The responsibility will be moved to the airline carrier to collect the duty in advance in either a flat duty rate of 30% or in a fee structure of $25 or $50 from the 1st of June. And these things either implemented through commercial or postal will come into effect from the 2nd of May.
Okay.
Which gives a little more time than last time for people.
It does, but it's not much time really, is it?
Not really. And I mean, for someone like us, we've been preparing like this for this for months. I mean, we're an ETOE, so we have access to postal solutions. And obviously we have an array of different commercial solutions, be it Type 86, which is Section 321, which will continue at this stage for non-China and Hong Kong origin goods. And then we have Type 11 and formal clearance, which will deal with the duties that need to be collected on China and Hong Kong origin goods. Now, one of the things that we developed when this happened in February was because we understand the data and we understand what is in the parcels, we're able to optimize routings for our customers. So many people will have some parcels that have an element of China and Hong Kong origin within them. But many of our retailers will also have goods that are manufactured elsewhere, and they don't need one rule for everything. So, for example, for anything that is non-China or Hong Kong origin, if people don't want that to go via commercial clearance and they want it to route via a postal clearance channel, for example, we can move the non-China and Hong Kong origin just as we would do now through something like Type 86. And then if they want the China and Hong Kong origin goods to move through postal, then we can enable that too, because we manage that sortation through the data and in our warehouse in Heathrow.
Okay, amazing. Oh, that's yeah. I mean, that's fascinating, really, isn't it? Because it gives the customer the ability to break it down rather than across one size fits all, one shoe fits all as such.
Yeah, I mean, in a situation like this, customers need options and options matter, and they need us as a service provider to deliver that for them.
Yeah, completely. And financially, there's a significant benefit to that, definitely.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. And then break it down in terms of the tariffs, what's that going to mean for, I guess, UK-based customers? I appreciate that there's a whole load of tariffs that are being announced across the world and the EU as such, but UK specifically, what does the tariffs mean for the UK customers?
Well, if we're still focusing on if we sort of now move to the second executive order that deals with the reciprocal tariffs, so where this becomes highly interesting is if de minimis remains in play for anywhere other than China and Hong Kong origin, actually for our e-commerce retailers, providing the goods remain below $800, then those goods just continue to move into the US duty-free, either via postal clearance or commercial clearance. So very much no change from today. However, in the reciprocal tariff executive order, in subsection H, so buried in this executive order is a statement around de minimis. And what this statement says is that at the point that they are potentially ready to collect duty, it could be widened to other countries outside of China and Hong Kong. So they're essentially putting the rest of the world on notice, and us in the UK, that the de minimis could be withdrawn for all other countries, so across the world. Now, I'm certainly not wanting to scaremonger, but it is a statement that is in the executive order. Now, implementation of that, make no bones about that, is really difficult. And actually trying to collect duty across postal and commercial channels for 200 plus countries is an enormous task. And they won't be anywhere near ready to do that yet, which is why they're only doing it on China and Hong Kong right now. But people do need to be aware that this could indeed be coming.
And I think that's it, isn't it? I think it's taking into consideration the fact that that has been mentioned and therefore preparing for that if it comes about, and making sure that you have the right facilities to prepare for it if it does become so that you're not caught off guard.
Exactly. And like we touched on before, our role in this has to be the trusted voice in the room. So making sure that we are very clear on the detail of these executive orders, that will be backed up then with the federal notices that will contain the implementation details, and making sure that we're working with our partners that are on the ground there to get factual information, feeding that back to retailers so retailers can make the right decision for their own businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree completely. And I think when big changes like this happen, I think some retailers always find that they don't have the right support in place for whatever reason. And they tend to find that out the hard way. Now, have you seen cases where businesses have had to pivot quickly because they've been let down?
Yeah, and I think absolutely. And one of the biggest cases of this was what happened in February. I mean, I appreciate the fact that it was delivered with no notice when the de minimis was withdrawn on China and Hong Kong origin. That obviously impacted goods that were being dispatched from the UK. But what kind of astounded me during that week was there were certain logistics providers that just didn't ship. They just didn't ship any goods because they were trying to work out how to cope with it. But I think as logistics providers, our job in this has to be problem solvers and come up with a range of solutions, because yes, it was unprecedented, but actually retailers and their consignees don't want to hear, "I'm really sorry, this appears to be a little bit difficult. Can you bear with us while we work it out?" They want you to be able to solve it and keep the parcels moving. So I think for us, that was one of the most staggering things of a lot of providers just didn't ship during that week, and we shipped every single day that week.
How did you keep things moving? How did in that scenario where everybody stood still, how did you ensure that you could keep moving forward and I guess achieve the deliverable rate that you mentioned before?
Because the options that we already have in place, and ultimately because our technology allows us to, and we have an incredible team. So the Starlinks Global team is what makes Starlinks Global. They are an incredible and phenomenal group of individuals. So you throw something at that team, I can guarantee you they'll solve it within 24 hours. And that's what they did. So as a group, we came together, we assessed the problem, and then we delivered a range of solutions, be it splitting, obviously understanding that this parcel was China origin, this parcel wasn't. Okay, so that parcel that's non-China origin can continue to go via Type 86. Then going out to our retailers and saying, would you like the China origin to go via Type 11? Would you like it to go via formal? Or would you like it to go via postal clearance? And that's how we managed to keep everything moving that week.
I mean, I think one thing that's probably clear from all of this stuff that's been happening over the past couple of months is disruptions can happen no matter what. And they can especially in the logistics space, they can happen very, very quickly and all of a sudden. Now, I know Starlinks have got a lot in terms of like predictive analytics and an element of proactive monitoring as well. So how does that play in Starlinks, and how does that, I guess, support your customers in preparing for these disruptions?
Yeah, I think, and this is the point we touched on earlier about in delivery, waiting for a problem to happen is it already too late? And so that's why we're tracking 100% of shipments against critical timed checkpoints and analysing patterns to predict delays before they impact retailers and customers. But the biggest thing in all of this is making sure people are aware of what's happening. So for us, if we see any problems anywhere in the network, then we go out to our retailers with proactive information of what's happening, but also with the parcel numbers. Because if we're telling them what's happening on a particular subset of parcels, then they can go out to their own customers with an information about these parcels may be delayed, this is why. And that stops Wizmos coming into them. And it means that actually the customer isn't going to be disappointed because they've had no information. At least they've been told. And to our point earlier about control, people want to understand what's happening. If you tell them, it will be fine. And so we spend a lot of time on that analysis and then ensuring that we're going out to our retailers with that information so they can in turn keep their customers informed.
Mm-hmm. No, I get it. It's all about just communication. I mean, no matter what you do in whatever industry you're in, I think communication is so key for people, because as people, we just want to understand where we sit. And therefore, I think in the buyer journey it's so important that we have that communication through. Again, we touched about that on the post-purchase. Now, I mean, look, you've touched upon the US stuff, which I really appreciate, because as I said, I think it's such a minefield for so many people trying to understand, especially brands, and I mean, some of our e-commerce providers are currently, or merchants, sorry, are currently looking at how they can expand into the US and other countries. And I think in January time, that looked like a much easier field than it currently is. And now they're looking at, okay, how can they actually start making those movements when there's so much uncertainty into it, which is why I think working with brands like yourself has so much importance, because you can provide that level of voice and, I guess, thought leadership and knowledge based and trusted voice, I think is what you used the word, to support those brands carrying on, because these things you have to stop.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're educated in what you do.
Exactly. I mean, I don't think anyone is saying that the US market is dead at all. I mean, it can't be. It's one of the biggest trading partners and one of the biggest markets for a number of retailers. But it's understanding now how to move forward and what options and how to use potential things like DDP that may have never been needed before. So retailers are going to have to potentially look at adapting checkouts. But working with somebody like us, we can really help guide them through the journey of what tariffs will need to be applied and how they can capture that at checkout. And then looking at things like duty drawback as well. So these are all the discussions we'll be having with our retailers.
I think that's it. I think there's such a benefit both from a knowledge aspect. The fact that brands won't need to learn the level of granularity that potentially that you guys have, and therefore they can focus on the selling and the aspect of pushing their brand forward rather than trying to learn how these changes are going to affect them. But also, if they get these wrong, it could be very, very, very costly. And therefore, there's a huge cost in that side of things in terms of just preparing and making sure that you're fitting it in the right way.
Exactly, and we can be their expert.
Perfect. So if there's one thing you want retailers to remember about Starlinks Global, what would that be?
That it really is never just a parcel. It's so important to us, and it's a belief that everybody holds dear at Starlinks Global. So every package represents a customer's trust, a retailer's reputation, and a sale that needs to be fulfilled. If that parcel is late or lost or stuck in customs, it's not just an operational issue, it's a potential lost customer. And here's the reality. The problem in the US isn't going away, but the good news is that at Starlinks Global, we've already built a seamless compliance solution. We're ahead of the curve while other carriers are still potentially scrambling for workarounds. So anyone shipping volume to the US needs a robust, future-proof logistics strategy. And if you don't have a plan in place now, you risk losing customers for good when the next wave of changes hits. So if you're an e-commerce brand selling into the US, let's talk. Because at Starlinks Global, it's never just a parcel. It's your business, your reputation, and your customer experience on the line. And we make sure you get that right.
Perfect. Look, Beth, that's amazing. Look, thank you so much for kind of going into that and giving us a really better overview of Starlinks, but also the changes that are happening currently in the US and the market and the post-purchase side of things, and how businesses can look to move forward confidently. There's a lot of value to that, so thank you very much for your time.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.